Hi everybody, thank you very much for joining. I'm just going to give everybody a minute or so to log in and get their audio sorted. Can see you all filtering it in now on the side, which is great. So we'll just give you a second or more to come in before we get started. Right, I think that looks like most people have joined us, so I think we can get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to the Young Fabians Labour Connected conference event on the future of work in a green economy. We're going to be discussing the future of work, a just transition for workers, and evolving trade unionism in a green industrial revolution. Can see as well now that we're live on Facebook, so good afternoon to everybody on there as well. I'm delighted to be joined by our panelists, Seema Malhotra MP, the Shadow Employment Minister, and Laurence Turner, Policy and Research Officer for GMB Union. I'll make sure to give both of our panelists a proper introduction in more detail shortly. My name's Laura Cunliffe-Hall and I'm Communications Officer for the Young Fabians Environment Network and a member of Young Fabians and Labour Women's Network. The Young Fabians is a youth branch of the Fabian Society and affiliate to the Labour Party, one of its original founders, and also Britain's oldest left-wing think tank that facilitates member debate and activism across the UK. As part of Labour Connected, we've got the youngest Young Fabian Fringe ever this year, and this is our fourth event with many more great events to come. Tonight's event is focused around trade unions and the green industrial revolution. We're currently facing down an economic crisis to a scale not seen in living memory. And at the same time, we're also living through a global climate and nature emergency. According to the UN, we have fewer than 10 years remaining to avert the worst impacts of catastrophic climate change. It's therefore crucial that we develop policies to get us to net zero emissions, protect our planet, and also make sure that we create high quality unionised jobs. In terms of how today's event is going to be structured, I'll just give a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, then I'll ask Seema and Laurence some questions before we open up to the floor for a Q&A to close out the sessions. Please can you write your questions in the Zoom Q&A function, and then I can put them to our speakers later on. As you can probably see at the top of your screens, this event is being recorded, so it will also be uploaded onto the Young Fabians YouTube channel. Please also feel free to share the Facebook Live link in the chat with anyone that you think might be interested. I'd now like to formally introduce our panel. Our first panellist is Seema Malhotra MP, the Shadow Employment Minister. Seema has been the Labour and Cooperative Member of Parliament for Feltham and Heston since 2011. She has served as Shadow Employment Minister under Keir Starmer since April 2020. Seema has also served as Labour's Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury and continues to keep an interest in economic affairs, how we grow and share prosperity and youth education achievement. In the Fabian Society's recent July 2020 report, Better Off, Seema wrote that we should leave no stone unturned in the quest to save the jobs we can and create the jobs that we need, jobs that will last and drive the green economic revolution. Seema has also advocated for more green investment from the government and to make sure that constituents' voices are heard in Parliament at this critical time for climate, nature and people. I'd also like to introduce our second panellist, Laurence Turner. Laurence is the Policy and Research Officer at GMB Union. Founded in 1889, GMB represents over 620,000 working people in all jobs and walks of life. GMB has been heavily involved in activity on air pollution as founder members of the trade union Clean Air Network, which looks at practical ways to improve air quality in the workplace. Laurence has previously worked in Parliament and as a political advisor to the Labour Party. He is also a trustee of the Dyspraxia Foundation. Recently, Laurence has been speaking out on the need for government to extend the coronavirus furlough scheme, calling on ministers to keep existing support schemes under careful review, extend them where necessary, and enter into meaningful talks on a sector-by-sector basis to protect jobs and household incomes. I'd like to kick off our discussion today by talking first and foremost about the green recovery, which is a massive topic at the moment. I think we can all say that 2020 has been a year none of us have expected. We've been plunged into crisis after crisis, beginning with the Australian wildfires that highlighted the severity of the climate crisis, which has then followed by the coronavirus pandemic that's led us into an economic and jobs crisis. Labour's Green Recovery Plan, which is spearheaded by Shadow Base Secretary Ed Miliband, seeks to rebuild us out of the crisis by focusing on creating a zero carbon army of young people retraining into green industries. After appropriating the rhetoric of the green recovery for a long time, we finally saw some action from government on Monday this week with the announcement of the 40 million Green Recovery Challenge Fund. My first question to both of you is, why is a green recovery so important? And how can Labour attract more widespread support behind it from the wider public? I'll go to Seema first and then to Laurence.
Great, thank you very much, Laura, and thank you to the Young Fabians. And I think this is one of the most important debates that we're going to have, not just through the economy questions for the conference, but also as a country. Because if we're looking at a green recovery, it is bringing two very key things together. One is the climate change challenge that I think was sort of reaching the debate about it being an emergency before COVID, but also the recovery that's going to be sustainable. If there's a couple of things that we've learned through COVID, the first is the lack of resilience that we had as an economy, and that is both in terms of how the workforce is structured, employment rights, protections for those who are in less unionized workplaces as well, with fewer protections for their rights. And that's been shown in the unemployment figures coming out. But also when we think about where we're going as a country with jobs, the world is changing. And if we're to look to sustainable skills and jobs for the future, it's got to recognize how we've got to change that, bringing on board new technology, ensuring that we've got skills to deliver that too. Now, the government has been frustratingly slow at this. The strategies published almost 10 years ago around green skills, light green skills that are more generic, dark green skills that may be more sector specific. They haven't really been embedded into any sort of skills development strategy since. And I think if we're not to lose the momentum and ensure that we've got competitiveness for our country, as well as answers to the challenges we face, and ways in which we are developing industry for meeting our own needs as a nation for the future, whether that's in energy or it's in transport or it's in how we produce goods, food, farming. There are many ways in which the green revolution has to see itself come through into our national economic life and ensure that we've got the competitiveness to be innovating for our country and for the world. So I think that when people understand that jobs, prosperity, our environment and how sustainable those jobs will be for the future, that having a green revolution has got to be part of that. I think it will bring more people on side and see that it's Labour that's talking about that and how we have a whole ecosystem that's lined up to deliver that.
Thank you very much, thank you. And Laurence, I'll put the same question to you about how can we get the public behind the green recovery?
Well, thank you, Laura. And it's really heartening to be at this event and to hear about the work being done across the Labour movement in the party and its affiliates on decarbonisation and the future of work, because there's no doubt that global warming is the most important long-term challenge that our planet faces. And trade union members and trade unions, we think, have a crucial role to play in shaping what form a future low-carbon economy should take. And we start by recognising that global warming is a class issue, that the costs of the degraded natural environment have been disproportionately borne by working people. We also recognise that if we do not form a Labour response to global warming, particularly at this time of COVID and government intervention, with good employment at the heart of that vision, then there's a real risk that working people could disproportionately bear the costs of the transition too. So at a time when the economy is being reshaped by coronavirus and government's response, and at a time when government intervention is more accepted, then the decisions that are taken today will have consequences for decades to come. We believe that there is no inherent conflict between social and environmental objectives, but it should be recognised that the right decisions haven't always been taken in the past. The decisions that have been made over transition at times have been done to workers and not with them. And there's a real opportunity for Labour to set out a different stall based on a principle of working with trade unions and working people. And you know, when you look at some of the principles that lay behind the COP24 declaration, Silesia Declaration on Solidarity and the Just Transition, it was really set out there that social dialogue is a key part of that process to create decent work and quality jobs. But unfortunately, we don't have a good history of social dialogue in this country. And that's why when the government sometimes talks about a green economic future, it's not related to sectors that our members can easily relate to. And we think there's a real political space there for the Labour Party at a time when the government's response has been short-term, and in terms of the funding, you know, which we can come on to talk about, has been tokenistic compared to the billions put in by other nations. So there's a real opportunity to relate its response to the world of work and to the situations that ordinary working people can relate to and deliver good quality jobs of the future. But part of that is recognising where things haven't gone right in the past and listening to the voices of working people.
Absolutely, and I think you raise a really important point there that, you know, Labour is the party of the working people and we need to make sure that we're acting in their interests. Labour recently have been very clear that Britain needs a national plan to protect jobs, create new ones, and also invest in skills and training. A survey commissioned by Client Earth found that a remarkable 63% of respondents supported a Green New Deal, which is defined as a large long-term investment in green jobs and infrastructure. My question to both of you is basically just making sure that how can all of our governments, both national, regional and devolved, most effectively deploy workers to shovel-ready green infrastructure projects, particularly those in the renewables sector, renewables construction, nature conservation and home insulation. So Seema, I'll go to you first.
Great, thank you very much for that. I think that this is so important because it is absolutely going to be critical to getting our economy moving again. And what has surprised me is why the government hasn't been so much clearer on the need to act with speed when it comes to investment, particularly in infrastructure projects that can be transformative for us as well as creating those jobs. And this is where I think it needs absolutely to have national leadership. I think we have an industrial strategy that is out of sync with sort of COVID time and looking at reprioritising and bringing forward projects more quickly. I also think that we've got to see better partnerships and more enabled partnerships with our devolved administrations and metro mayors. And I think it's worth just making a mention about how I think Andy Burnham and some of the sort of combined authority work around Manchester, also how Liam Byrne has been leading new conversations in the West Midlands, and even how Sadiq has been able to use the links from City Hall to set up partnerships with local authorities, very much looking at how a lot of our response has also got to be local authority led, so that jobs in future are also going alongside health. And this is why I think the leadership point, you know, and the new leadership point that our conference is making as well, is looking for new leadership for our country. Because I think what it has felt like to me is that you know, we've got a government at the moment that keeps fighting old battles. It feels like a tired government, and it's not looking forward innovatively to the future. But if I could just say, just a couple of points about the shovel-ready green infrastructure projects. So the government made some leaning towards this with home insulation work that was announced. But when you look at how the government announces things, it should be doing it so as to incentivize new behavior, not to disincentivize work that was already going to go ahead, with people saying, should I delay investment because will it then be eligible for a new scheme? Because announcements without detail and without clarity on how the market's working are not actually increasing productivity or creating those jobs or seeing the change that we want, both for homes to then result in lower bills, but also for industry and where there needs to be transformation. I think, just to say, I think there's other ideas as well. So Hounslow, as part of its regeneration strategy, is looking at, for example, solar farms. Can solar farms that can then look at creating energy and supplying energy to homes and businesses in the local area be both a solution for part of a solution for jobs and the green recovery, but also more sustainable in terms of benefits for local communities. So I think we've got to be looking at how do we bring all of this together. It's got to be national leadership with local voice, and so that people are benefiting and we're seeing sustained change. I'll just make a final point about jobs, because I think that Laurence was absolutely right about good employment needing to be part of this. And I just want to make a mention about good employment that's inclusive, because too much of this debate can be very sort of slanted towards male jobs. But actually, the way we think about the green revolution has got to be looking at inclusivity, for women, for those with disabilities, new ways in which we're seeing access to those skills and those jobs. Access to those jobs has got to be as much part of the story as creating those jobs. And I think there's many good examples that I'll draw on through the session, but really keeping that in mind, because inclusivity has got to be key and a key principle for how we recover.
I completely agree with that, thank you. And I think some really important points there, particularly in terms of inclusivity. Laurence, do you have anything to expand on regarding to those points?
Thanks, Laura. And I think Seema hit the nail on the head when she said that there's been a deficit in national leadership and of industrial strategy in these questions. And when we talk about the types of technology that we're investing in, and in particular renewable energy, the brutal truth is that if we were to put a large amount of additional money into spending on renewables, principally in offshore wind, then it just wouldn't deliver jobs in the UK to anything like the scale that is needed. I think the point is very well made that a lot of those jobs were not as accessible as they should have been to people from diverse backgrounds. But it's been a traumatic and difficult time for the labour movement as a whole, particularly those unions that have a base in the manufacturing and production sectors. And while it's been said that new jobs can be created in the green economy, the problem is that that is not come to pass, or not in any comparable sense. So around £500 million a year is spent in subsidies to renewable developers by BEIS, which is mostly targeted at offshore wind farms. But the jobs that were predicted just haven't materialised. So to give an example, in 2011, the Scottish Government said that by 2020, the offshore wind sector could deliver up to 28,000 direct jobs and a further 20,000 indirect jobs in Scotland alone. And in 2014, Vince Cable, when he was Biz Secretary, said that offshore wind could support 30,000 jobs in the supply chain across the UK by 2020. But in fact, the latest ONS estimate suggests that offshore wind employs just under 3,000 people in Scotland. That's indirect and direct jobs combined, or just 6% of what was predicted. And similar patterns have played out across the UK as a whole. And I'd really recommend some of the reports that the STUC has done on this topic, which demonstrates the paucity of a return on taxpayers' investment in terms of jobs and skills. So I think we're entitled to ask what's gone wrong at this point and what can we fix before we start a new round of spending on green stimulus measures. And the reality is that around 10, 15 years ago, that was the time to put an industrial strategy in place with a view to developing the UK supply chain. And that's what other countries did, such as Germany, which have a long history of taking a more activist stance on developing their own sectors. And during privatisation, we lost large-scale domestic public interest development capacity, which means that investments is dominated by developers with globalised supply chains, and some of those in the renewable sector are hostile to the very principle of trades unionism. So where we've seen work that could have been won in the UK, which is subsidised by taxpayers, such as manufactured jackets and other fabrications for wind turbines, in reality, those orders have been out of reach. The fabrication work is done in yards in China, the United Arab Emirates, or Indonesia, where wages are as low as £2.80 an hour, while domestic fabrication yards like Bifab lie empty. And we think there's a real risk that unless a different approach is taken, then economic stimulus measures put in place today could result in similar negative outcomes. And when you look at some of the advice that's been produced from some economists, they've argued quite explicitly that you should put investment into renewables because you'll deliver construction jobs in the short term, but enable you to employ fewer people in energy production over the long term. And this is a time when insecure work is on the rise, and we know what happens to people and communities when those high-skilled, relatively high-wage jobs are lost. So there's a real need to do something different. Devolution, better spending with local government and the devolved nations, I think, is part of the answer. So the UK is very centralised. We've got a Labour government in Wales, but most capital expenditure is not devolved to the Welsh government. But alongside renewables, where we think instead of the contracts for difference auction mechanism, that public ownership and public delivery could be one way of delivering more jobs in the UK and getting that stimulus measure in place. That the big shovel-ready project in low carbon and renewable energy is in nuclear. We've seen a lot of economic benefits flow from the decision to invest in Hinkley Point C. There's a planning application on the table at the moment for Sizewell C, and that's £16 billion of investment, delivering up to 10,000 jobs. We think that really needs to be part of the mix too. GMB's worked really hard at Hinkley Point to boost the case of a more diverse employment, including women in construction. We've made some real progress there, which could be extended to Sizewell C. So those are some of the options and some of the problems. And I think we do need a recognition in the Labour movement that investment in renewables, sadly, so far has not delivered the jobs that we need to see.
I think some really interesting points you've raised there, Laurence, and particularly in terms of how we're behind compared to a lot of our European neighbours. For example, German, Italian and Spanish companies are now investing over 6 times more than UK companies in low carbon technologies. I've got a related question for Seema, which is how can we support UK-based low carbon industries further to make sure that we can actually catch up with these countries and make sure that we hit our net zero target?
This is absolutely right. And I think when you look at the figures, it continues to shock really that the UK seems to lag behind in this way, and there doesn't need to be any reason for it. I've raised this issue specifically in Parliament as well, as to why we are behind Germany, Spain and other countries. I think what's key is that comes back to the having a strategy that's integrated, that's based perhaps around some modern thinking, innovative thinking around missions. I know that Mariana Mazzucato, who's been one of the leaders in how we should think as a nation and draw together resources into a sort of shared purpose, will be speaking at the conference this week as well, and thinking about new leadership around our industrial strategy. But the reason why is because these are big ticket items, and you need to be working in partnership with local areas, with skills and development providers, but thinking strategically as well about skills transferability. This was one of the very important questions in the sort of the Heathrow third runway time, if you like, in that Lord David Blunkett led a skills task force that was more than about the third runway. It was actually asking a national question, which is, if we are to have big projects, how do we make sure that we develop skills that can then be coordinated and then be developed to, so that those, there can be transferability of scientists, of engineers, of apprentices to move on to the next projects and build a sort of national skills base, and do that in a coordinated way. And I think some of what Ed Miliband has laid out with a sort of idea of a zero carbon army is not just looking to one project now, but looking to how do we build a lifetime of projects one after the other, and think strategically as a nation about how we do that and about where the investment should come from for that. So those are really important, but also the way in which we build partnerships with our unions, with employers, around new projects. I mean, I was disappointed this year. I think the government hasn't given really the go-ahead to the Swansea Bay Tidal Lagoon, which has, in a sense, is, Welsh MPs have been talking about and supporting. But innovative long-term projects. If there are issues about some aspects of those projects, you've still got to be thinking long-term and looking at what even the concepts and the work done so far could offer, and how you can work with that. So sharing analysis and ideas like we're starting to think about in relation to Heathrow and aviation. I mean, the aviation recovery is going to be much slower than other sectors, but just as has been raised by Keir Starmer as well at PMQs and mentioned on MAR today as well, aviation's part of how our economy is going to need to grow, and also when you look at our exports and trade across the world. But we can't say the past is just going to come back. We've got to look at what are the future opportunities and how we're going to invest in those, and how do we look to a greener future for aviation, and how do we lead that debate. And so some of what Labour's been talking about, including around conditionality for some of the support that comes from government for industries at this time, is important, because what we want to see is sustainability. The future is not going to be the same as the past, but how we make sure that the skills go with where investment's going to be, and that jobs come through. Jobs for local people is also a very important part of that.
Absolutely, I think it's really important, and just making sure as well that local people don't feel like they have been left behind, and that these jobs do come through for them. We sort of spoke earlier on about making sure that any transition would be just. This obviously requires fairness, and again, this concept we spoke about bringing workers with us to make sure we maintain that public support. And now that applies even more broadly in our economy that's been so hugely affected by COVID-19. My question for both of you is, are the retraining packages that Seema mentioned briefly earlier providing workers with the ability to upskill in clean industries such as energy efficient building upgrades, carbon capture, and offshore wind technology? Are these type of schemes the key to the future of work? And also, how can we actually make these schemes work in practice, and make sure that, sort of Laurence raised a really important point earlier about making sure that workforces feel like plans are happening and they're beneficial for them, not just happening to them. So Laurence, I'll go to you first on that one, if that's okay.
Thanks, Laura. And training, retraining schemes are really interesting, because we've got a lot of evidence now about what works and what doesn't work. And the most effective schemes, particularly in cases where you're looking at industrial transition, the decline of some industries, and workers trying to make the move to new employment, are occupation specific. And where we have seen training schemes that have worked in the past, including some of the work that was done around the South Wales steel industry, some of the most effective schemes have been those which have been developed in partnership with trade unions and which are linked to industrial qualifications and certificates. Where you have generalised skills training, the evidence suggests that it's not as effective, and we've seen examples of this from the shipbuilding industry, to give an example, where people were promised that there would be training and help to redeploy, and then the actual quality of what was delivered doesn't live up to the task. And we're in a really unfortunate position because the government have been developing a national retraining scheme, which was at an early stage in its development when the COVID outbreak hit. It does focus at the moment on those quite general numeracy and literacy skills. We don't think it's a quality at the moment which will assist people back into work or to deliver the skills which are needed in these key environmental sectors. We think a good place to start in terms of where skills training is needed is our Tier 4 shortage occupation list. There are skills areas such as certain welding trades where there's a real deficit in skills in the UK, and certain industries have become reliant on contractors who would come in to deliver particular jobs, and the mobility of labour for totally understandable reasons is so much more limited now that they're really struggling. So there are areas where the skills development is needed, but all I'd say is that we need to be really careful in this area, because there are some workers who will always struggle to access retraining, particularly older workers, and where retraining skills are online first or online only, that introduces a new barrier. And where we have evidence from mass layoffs, what Public Health Wales has called mass unemployment events, there are always some workers who just exit the labour market, often in poor health, and without or often taking early retirement on reduced pensions. This is something we would need to work really hard to avoid. So by all means, we should be trying to develop those retraining skills in partnership with trade unions. We want to be engaging with government and the Labour Party, as we are with the Labour Party, on those topics, but where jobs can be saved in existing industries, and where existing industries can be greened with environmental conditions perhaps attached to any bailouts, then that needs to be part of the picture as well. And I think that's a point Seema made really powerfully in Fabian cited pamphlet earlier this year.
Great, thank you very much. I think you've raised some really pertinent points there. Seema, do you have anything to add regarding sort of improving, providing people with green skills and making sure that they feel comfortable with the way in which they're trained and upskilled, and this actually is an effective programme for workers?
I think this is going to be absolutely critical to the inclusive recovery, because we're seeing the numbers of people who are in work who are having to either leave their jobs or see a threat to their jobs increasing, and that more unemployment is coming through older workers as well in the later figures. I think there's a really important part of this, which is the union involvement, and for it to also be quite targeted towards sectors in terms of how we look at recovery. And one of the ideas that's come forward from, say, the sort of West London area, where Heathrow is a major issue. I've got the third highest number of furloughed employments in the country. Unemployment in my constituency is rapidly approaching 10%, which is well higher than the national average at the moment as well. And these things are connected. And this is an area that is for a sub-region quite a serious issue as to how we respond. And so the idea of a sort of aviation communities fund, I mean, it's not very specific, but the concept of infrastructure development, supporting small businesses, making sure that there's enough skills and education. There are some projects I think have been you know, not just in our area, but across the country, skills escalators, if you like. And what they are is targeting funding to in-work upskilling. And too often we think about skilling and reskilling to be once you've left a workplace. But there's a really important role for skilling when you're still in the workplace. And if you are seeing people lose their jobs, I've been talking about the need for employer-to-employer bridges, where we need to see the whole system come together. So if people are leaving one employer, how is our system, our education system, our social security system, our industry looking to be partners in this, so that people are helped through a transition into where there may be new jobs in another organisation or company. I've seen locally that GMB and Unite have been really innovative as well, helping and supporting. And there's a project that we're starting with Unite, who've got a facility that's involving Ruskin College, based on where there's successful hubs elsewhere, looking to where there can be targeted local training, supported for union members and non-members as well, community-based learning hub that is industry targeted and has actually got industrial qualifications that can be part of that, as well as more generic and employability skills. And that framework, unions who have got representatives in so many of our workplaces, I've written to 70 companies, large companies in the aviation and non-aviation space locally, with the unions to look at issues that they're facing and how to help keep people in work. And these kind of partnerships that lever in adult education funding and work alongside the Job Centre and Kickstart programs and others are really important. So I think some of the initiatives and how we innovate with them, including sector-based work academies, which I think are going to be critical, and I'm trying to look to how we might see 2 more start in West London, but looking to where they're working well across the country and at higher volume, and be really challenging about quality, because I think that's a real question about the DWP at the moment. What's the quality that they're looking to achieve in terms of interventions and outcomes for both younger and older workers and those wanting to access the labour market? And how do we ensure that the resources are sufficient behind that? Emma Hardy and Kate Green, who have been working on skills, have been very key in this as well. I'll close by saying this point, a point that I've been making for months. A jobs plan needs a skills plan. And at the moment, there isn't enough coherence in what the government's putting forward. And the adult education budget, which I raised in Parliament last week as well, whilst the number of unemployed older people is doubling or more, the budget has been frozen since last year and was not increased in the July statement. So this is a really critical area for our next phase of recovery. It's one that we've got to see an integrated strategy for jobs and for skills and for inclusivity.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And I think it's absolutely integral that we do see that action and the strategy to provide workers with these protections that they need. You spoke there about the role of unions. Obviously, unions have been key to negotiating safe working practices and sometimes entire sectors during the coronavirus crisis. And it's imperative that the government listens and engages with the unions for the sectors that have been most heavily impacted by the coronavirus crisis. Currently, the UK has a pretty low rate of vacancies coming back into the job market. So protecting people's links with their existing employers is therefore more important than ever. So Laurence, sort of as a result of that, I wanted to ask you which sectors need the most help and the most support, and what work is going on at the moment at GMB to make sure that all these workers are supported in these times that are so uncertain.
Yeah, it's an extremely difficult time, I think, for everyone, including in the union movements. Can't give an exhaustive list, but we've got members in parts of construction, parts of manufacturing, ceramics industry, aviation, cash in transit, parts of the security industry, where the demand is not going to recover in time for the end of the job retention scheme period. And we've been active really from day one, and ran a table with other unions, with BEIS, the Treasury and other departments, which traditionally, you know, in recent years haven't had that level of engagement with the unions. And at the start of the crisis, they were very keen to engage. And it was the unions who were around the table making that direct case for a job subsidy scheme, which became the job retention scheme, which, you know, there are problems with it. And that 80% floor, I mean, it's not always appreciated, but the 80% also applies to the minimum wage, for example. So we have members who are now paid at 80% of the minimum wage rate, because it's not protected under furlough. But by and large, it has been an effective scheme at protecting jobs, and that funding has been channeled into the sectors which were at greatest risk, or at least in the private sector. We've also negotiated industrial agreements. So JCB in the West Midlands is a really good example of this, where large-scale job losses were initially proposed and the company was serious about carrying it through. And through very difficult negotiations, a temporary working agreement was found, which has enabled those jobs to be retained on a short hours basis, without a long-term commitment to changes to terms and conditions, you know, which should revert once demand hopefully returns. And the union's been at the national level, including in expanding the key worker list, for example, in the very early days of the crisis. And now in employers up and down the country, we're in those really difficult redundancy consultations and doing everything we can to save jobs. And in terms of what happens next, I think the Labour Party, the Labour movement have been of one voice in saying that ending furlough with no replacement scheme is going to be a disaster for the economy. And we know the OBR's predicted that between 10 and 20% of all furloughed employments will be lost to unemployment unless there is a change in government policy. And there's a choice, really. Do they go down the road of having sector level agreements, which are tailored to each sector, where you could build in some of those green conditions? So the bailout of Air France KLM, you know, €10 billion settlement with green conditions is an example which we've said, if the government wanted to look at a solution like that for the aviation industry, then by all means, let's talk about it. As long as those conditions are subject to meaningful consultation and discussion with the workers in that industry, then let's have a constructive engagement. There are other options as well. So one scheme which worked well historically was the temporary employment subsidy of the Wilson and Callaghan years. And under that scheme, for every employer where redundancies of 10 or more were proposed, then wage subsidies of around a third to half of wages were provided up to 12 months to help keep people in work, which may be a scheme. If they're not going to extend furlough, then a scheme based on subsidised wages for people who are at work rather than people who are temporarily away from work may be one option. But then the question is, how do you build the green conditions back into that scheme? And a mix of the two approaches may be what we end up with. But I think, you know, we're making those cases, including for our submissions to the comprehensive spending review, but all eyes are on the Treasury and the Chancellor for the announcements that are coming in the budget and the CSR. But I will just say that, you know, it's really appreciated and valued how consistent the Labour Party's position has been in calling for an extension and for sector-specific negotiations. It's making a difference, and hopefully we can get to a better position when those Treasury announcements are made.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that, Laurence. I think that's actually a really interesting point to which to open it up to some of the questions we've had in from attendees. We've had a question that states, how does Labour create a green agenda that's more progressive than the Tories and also reduces emissions faster, while at the same time giving voters the confidence that they can handle the financials and the purse strings competently? So I'll go to Seema first for that one.
Great, thank you very much. I think the the first point I would make is about competence in administration. I think when you look at how the government has been working and how they've often been too slow, not joined up even on some basic things like I was talking about on jobs and skills coming together. The first thing is going to be about competence, because I've seen even in the way that shadow teams are talking to each other, are looking at how do we share ideas and how do we have an integrated response. I think what's going to be important is to think, what do you do with the green revolution as well? How is it going to transform our, say, housing stock through retrofitting and other ideas for future homes? How is it going to look at transforming our energy generation, energy supply, reducing bills? How is it going to transform our transport? How's it going to transform how our industry works? There are many areas, as well as thinking about how are we going to transform research and development, and how universities and academics work with industry. There were many ideas that we had that also, were important structures for enabling some of this. I was involved very much with regional development agencies when they were in existence, which the Tories scrapped in 2010. But what was so important about the principles about how they worked, which you can look to how you might reinvent in different ways for the future, were looking at how areas came together to help make local decisions and linked some of that research, that industry, place-based response together. And it was done with the voice of Whitehall connected in with what was going on in the regions. If I give you one example of how it's been different under the Tories, when I asked David Davis, when he was the Brexit secretary and I was on the select committee, how many officials he had from his department of 400 employees at the time outside London, the answer was 0. And the way that, even prior to devolution and thinking about all of these things, Labour thought about governance in a much more strategic way for our country. And we have actually seen a centralisation of decision-making that has had impact, I think, in terms of our effectiveness of response to the COVID pandemic, and in the inability of the government to operate at speed, because it's broken some of that infrastructure across the country. And so I think thinking about leadership and competence and how we ask these questions, how we work with the sectors and how we work with the unions, I just build on one point as well that that Laurence made, which is about how the unions were, in part of discussions with Bayes and others at the start of the pandemic. And the feedback I've had is that whilst there have been those conversations, it hasn't resulted in decision-making and in an integrated way as quickly as it needs to be, and certainly not in a way that's been rolled out. In terms of the urgency, there are already notices going out, Section 188 notices from employers, on the basis that furlough is going to end at the end of October. And therefore, without having any other game in town about how there might be incentives to help keep people in work as where we know demand is likely to come back next year, as the crisis to some extent abates and some of the potentially vaccines and other technology comes online, how are we going to keep people in work rather than have to re-recruit with all the effort it will take to train, which will actually slow down our recovery? I mean, there is a business case as well, because there's a cost of not looking to how we look to a targeted and flexible furlough scheme after the end of October. And jobs are going to be lost now that could be saved if the government made an announcement sooner. That's why I've said in Parliament as well that I think this is urgent, and it's urgent to keep people in the jobs that will be there and will be sustainable after this scale, after the sort of immediacy of the pandemic starts to abate.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think you raised some really important points, particularly about making sure that the jobs that can be saved, making sure that they are saved in this immediate moment when we have the agency to do that at this stage. Laurence, do you have anything to add regarding the green agenda?
Not so much on that question, no.
Thank you very much. There's a question that's quite interesting regarding the circular economy and if it would be possible to implement that with Tory opposition. So Laurence, I'm going to go to you first on that one.
Thank you. And some really interesting things have been done in Preston around this question. The problem is at the moment that under the rules as they exist, the attempts to keep spending either within industries, within a local area, have to be done somewhat against the spirit of those rules. So we've seen contracts broken down into their constituent parts to enable that circular economy, and there's some evidence that it's worked particularly well. This is an area where we see it in practice at a national level in defence, where the usual restrictions on procurement don't apply because of those quite clear national security exemptions. And we do see in that sector the benefits from having a concentrated supply chain. In fact, GMB is one of the signatories to the 2018 Devonport Environmental Management Agreement, and that is able to have a significant impact in the supply chain because there is good visibility of that supply chain, and it is connected quite clearly to the Tier 1 contractors in the Ministry of Defence and Babcock Marine. And just going back to something Seema was talking about in terms of that more regional and local governance approach, I remember, so I'm from Nottinghamshire, and I remember that in some of the former mining villages, that there was a really exciting initiative that was put together, something called the Sherwood Energy Village, which brought together national agencies, local councils and the private sector on a single site to help develop the direct employment and the skills that were needed to help sustain them in an area of really significant unemployment and intergenerational poverty inherited from the dismemberment of the mining industry in the 80s and 90s, and that just was not sustained after 2010, and the project is no more, and it is an enormous loss, I think, to the economy in that area of the country. And I think this is a question that is being talked about a lot within the party, including during the leadership election. I think we think that there's a lot that could be done around local transport links, and the investment that's going into HS2 is a kind of good example of the way that you deliver those policies can have a big impact on whether it aggregates demand and economic activity into the centre, into the cities, or spreads it into the surrounding villages and towns. And in that case, getting the onward connections, affordable local transport, public transport networks is key to that. And of course, if you can deliver well-planned, regularly serviced bus networks with affordable fares, and I declare an interest because we are a union that represents bus workers, then the evidence clearly shows from France and elsewhere that you can spread the benefits of that investment in a circular way rather than concentrating it in the centres of the highest economic demand, which is really the kind of George Osborne approach to economic development that we need to move beyond. But just something I'll say, I know time is tight, that we are still working under the restrictions on procurement imposed by the World Trade Organization. You know, it's often thought that once we're out of the EU, that a whole range of new possibilities will be opened up to guarantee that we have spending in the UK and put additional conditions on the supply chain. Actually, those restrictions are there under the WTO treaties as well. It's an organization which is in a period of, I think you can describe a crisis at the moment, largely due to the hostility of the Trump administration. But whereas the United States and China have had, in effect, opt-outs from those measures. The UK has not. We think internationally, including union movement, working for its affiliates, this is a time to make that case for saying, particularly in environmental areas, let's have a rules-based system to be able to say that we will deliver those jobs and that investment funded by taxpayers here in the UK.
Absolutely, thank you very much, Laurence. And Seema, really quickly, I'll just pose that same question to you, and if you could wrap closing remarks, that'd be fab.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really useful question, and I think Laurence gave a very kind of good perspective from the employment side. I just want to touch on it from a green side and a green economy, because in a sense, the sort of idea of a circular economy that's been going around much more over the last sort of 7-8 years has been looking at how we could see reduced waste, and that you've got a strategy for renewal that comes from, you know, a different approach and different strategy for manufacturing and industry. And it does require different thinking. It requires different leadership. It isn't an area, again, if you go back to what I was saying about the industrial strategy not really being in line with where we are, it's a place where the government's been very slow to catch up in terms of thinking strategically about economic development, economic growth at a local and regional level, and in line with national priorities. And I think there's great opportunity to be thinking now, because our recoveries are going to be locally led. You know, we're serious when we say in the Labour Party that we're serious about, you know, saving lives as well as livelihoods, and how much, especially with cyclic lockdowns, is going to be locally led. And employment strategies, including for making something like, you know, Kickstarter, you know, which, you know, has really got to learn from the Future Jobs Fund that Labour brought in to be successful, are going to be very key. So in West London, for example, that's sort of, you know, the half of West, or the third of London from north down to the southwest, has got a West London waste strategy, and that has for some time been thinking about how it integrates the waste strategy alongside the economic development strategy. And some of those strands are actually coming together in this post-COVID economic recovery planning. I think there's a lot that government can actually learn from how areas, including, for example, some of the projects going on in Scotland, some projects going on that Andy Burnham's working on, some around Liverpool as well, are thinking in this way. The government should be learning in the sense sort of, you know, retrofitting back into an industrial strategy, because there's not going to be time to make mistakes. Where the you know, the shared prosperity fund goes, how we think about where funding gets allocated post Brexit as those, you know, the skills funds as well, where we think about investment in universities, where we think about partnerships with industry. Those are going to be big decisions, and the government's got to be much faster at working with what's going on the ground so that we realise some of these opportunities now.
Thank you so much, and I think that's a really excellent point on which to bring things to a close, a kind of call for immediate action that we need to work towards a future that is not only fairer for everyone, but is also a greener, more sustainable future. Thank you both so much, Seema and Laurence. I think there's been some really interesting and insightful contributions today, and has definitely left us all with a lot of food for thought. Before we go, I'd just like to quickly encourage you to check out the other fantastic Young Fabian Fringe events going on at Labour Connected. I believe we've got an event coming up just under half an hour on a similar topic, the Green Industrial Revolution in the North East, and I think that'll particularly expand on some of the points we've covered today in terms of devolution and empowering local authorities, so one not to be missed. Finally, I'd just again like to say a massive, massive thank you to Seema and Laurence for joining us today, and to all of you for attending and for your questions. And I hope that you have a lovely rest of Sunday evening. Please check out Young Fabian's Twitter, follow us at Young Fabians, and our Facebook pages and website if you'd like to get involved. And thanks so much again to Seema and Laurence for their time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.